The Memory of Love, Chapter 35. How have you been sleeping? Any more dreams? Elias called laughs, a flame-filled rasp. This is not the place for a good night's sleep. You are being woken. There's always something, somebody dying or trying to. The doctors and nurses make it their business to interfere. Do you manage to sleep again? I wonder who's next. Afraid this sleep will be the final one. On the other hand, if the dream is good, they laugh again. Adrian smiles. I can ask the doctor to prescribe something if you like. What would be the point? Let me know if you change your mind. Of course. He pulls himself up in the slow, deliberate way of a man whose every movement is laced with pain. He coughs, and the coughing takes over his whole body. Adrian waits. Elias Cole wipes his mouth with a cloth. I'm not a superstitious man. I was born in the city. I don't hold with Babagale's country beliefs. For him, there's no such thing as a natural death. We'd all live forever, but for the curses heaped upon us by our enemies. He looks up at Adrian. In the dark, all manner of thoughts come to mind. You begin to imagine. Imagine what? It is something of a coincidence, is it not? The way I am dying, so similar to Julius's own end. And you think perhaps your pulmonary fibrosis is the result of a curse? Adrian shifts in his chair, interested. The old man turns, their eyes meet. Elias Cole smiles, and in that moment looks suddenly quite different. Keen, cold, alert. Adrian catches the glint in his eye. The side he sees of Cole is not his public face. Elias Cole had been quite a different animal on the outside, 10, 20 years ago. It occurs to Adrian he would not have liked to come up against him. Adrian leans back. Let's just call it dramatic irony, shall we? Says the old man. Our first night together, we dined at the Ocean Club. I felt people were staring at us. At a time when talk could have undesirable consequences, gossip filled the void. After we had eaten, Safia and I returned to the house on the campus. The work on the house was finished, and on the whole, we well executed. I guided Safia from room to room. Some things still needed work. The stock of furniture that came with the property was underwhelming and looked as if it might have been chosen by a blind man. Curtains in a toxic shade of yellow, a wooden framed sofa covered in red print, a chair covered in yet another brightly patterned fabric. It was a rocking chair, which we later discovered had a habit of overreaching its tipping point and depositing the occupants on the floor. I was never a man of taste. The decor in my own apartment had never risen far above the merely functional, but Safia had an eye for detail, and so, in my imaginings, I'd show her the house, newly roofed and painted, and then we would laugh together at the furnishings, and in the weeks that followed, Safia would make redecorating the house her first project, or so I hoped. She surveyed the room from the edge. Impossible not to notice how her gaze never alighted upon an object, but hovered restlessly. I made some quip or other, asking her opinion. A little game I had planned in which I pretended momentarily to admire the decor. Foolish as it turned out. Safia turned to me and smiled, held me in the same unseeing gaze with which she had contemplated the room, and said, It's a very fine house indeed, Elias. Thank you. Did she love me? I don't think so. Did it matter? Not at the beginning. I thought by then Safia had moved beyond ideas of love. But I'm a jealous man. I'd been jealous of my younger brother, not so much for the fact of my mother's love for him. It was his joy I envied. I suppose the very quality that made people respond to him as they did. He was an absurdly happy child, and I could never fathom why. I'd been jealous of Julius for possessing Safia. I'd even grown jealous of Kekura and Yansane, of the dancer, of any man who came near her. Imagine then how it feels to find yourself in a love triangle with a ghost. Your rival, complacent in death, can never misstep or disappoint. Julius had less Safia, yet in dying he had at the same time atoned for all his sins, for his colossal selfishness and grandiose stupidity. And if I sound like I am contradicting myself, I am not. I merely described the contortions of which the human heart is so eminently capable. A memory. Making love to Safia. I touch her back for a few seconds until she turns to me. She is utterly immobile. I kiss her. I caress her. She places her arms around me, but there is something held back. Her touch on my skin is altogether too light, as if she hesitates to make contact. In the moonlight that slips into the room from behind the blind, I see her eyes are open. I remember Vanessa, her whispered encouragement and breathy endearment. With Vanessa, I could succeed in losing myself. Vanessa had mastered the tricks of coquetry and seduction, and she applied them to my pleasure. Vanessa could be a generous lover to those lovers who were generous to her. I remember the simulated passion of the girl from the bar. At least she showed me some gratitude. She admired me. A man needs some encouragement. I even feel a little tenderness towards her. It is not true. I feel no tenderness towards the girl, a girl whose livelihood depended upon feigned pleasure. The same is true of Vanessa. Vanessa merely occupies a higher league. Her ambitions greater and hence her abilities all the more finely tuned. The truth, if you want it, was that it had never bothered me. I did not expect a woman to enjoy the act in the same way as a man. There was a time when these women were good enough for me. The act of lovemaking as performed with them was good enough, but no longer. I am not comparing what I had with them to what I have with Safia. It is all a lie. Instead, I'm remembering a day when I drove from the university campus to a pink house on the hill with a truckload of chairs for a party that evening. I cannot halt the memory. It enters my brain like a thief, sleeping like the moonlight behind the blind. I'm remembering entering through the open door into the darkened recesses of the house. I'm remembering standing alone in that wide open space, listening to a sound coming from somewhere behind a closed bedroom door. I'm remembering the coarse humor and laugh of the truck driver, and I'm remembering the heat rising in my face. And this, the truth now, is what I was thinking, that until the truck driver laughed his filthy laugh, I had been unable to place the sounds we both had. They were unfamiliar to me because I had no idea what a woman's pleasure sounded like. And when I heard it for the first time that day, it sounded nothing like Vanessa. And I knew that Vanessa had been doing to me, and I was angry. I had the visceral reality, wild, abandoned, unheeding, and unmistakable. That is what I remember as I lie with Safia. Despite myself, the memory arouses me. But Safia does not feign her pleasure. The anger returns. It rises and keeps me going. I become frenzied, and suddenly I'm spent. There came a time when I became jealous even of Safia, what she kept inside and would not share. My jealousy, frustrated and unappeased, transformed into anger, a low, unworthy rage. I wished to break her. At mealtimes, I would sit watching as she chewed her food, observing the working of her jaw, the way she swallowed. For a while, it became a minor obsession. I watched her surreptitiously as she moved around the house. As she read a book, I sawed or made a shopping list. If ever she happened to turn in my direction and see me looking, she would smile at me. That skin deep smile with which I had become so familiar, and I would smile back. I watched her at other times too. In the old days, I might have contrived to bump into her in this place or that place, discover her plans, and make sure they coincided with mine. Now I tried and failed to catch her out in small lies and evasions. I read meaning into even the most open statement. I looked through her papers and belongings. I didn't know what I was looking for. I suspected her of nothing at all, except of not caring for me. Meanwhile, she ran the house, planned my meals, attended to every domestic duty. She listened and replied to my conversation. That was what made it so terrible. A Tuesday, I'd been working in my office all morning. The short walk to work was one of the conveniences of living on campus. Sometimes, on my way between the library and the office, I would walk the 100 yards up the hill. I could tell if Safia was home by whether or not the car was parked outside. I might wander up there 2 or 3 times a day. Thanks to my recent promotion, I was less and less often to be found among the archives. I still lectured and I still researched and wrote. But more of my work was now made up of administrative duties. I did not complain. It suited me. To be honest, simple, measurable, and on the whole achievable goals. I kept in touch with developments in the academic world. Over the years, I published several papers. One of them on early monetary systems achieved significant critical praise and contributed to my eventual professorship, though all that was yet to come. The car was in the drive. I was about to turn away when I saw Safia leaving the house, her head wrapped in her distinctive orange scarf. She didn't get into the car and drive off, as might be expected. Instead, she set off in the opposite direction, across the campus. After a moment's hesitation, I followed her. I followed her all the way to the eastern gate of the campus. The entrance was little used for the simple reason it was a long walk from the main campus buildings. However, it enjoyed the advantage of leading straight into a parade of houses and shops, one of the old Creole villages. It was an alternative place to pick up transport. Safia hailed a taxi, slipped inside, and drove off. At dinner that night, I asked her about her day. I noticed she said nothing about her trip outside the campus. The next day, I called Baba Gale. He was with us by then, sent from the village by the aunt, though altogether a much more amenable personality. Much easier for Baba Gale to go unnoticed. There was a risk involved in my request. He was one of Safia's people. His loyalty to me was untested. I forget how, but I made it sound as though it was all being done for Safia's sake. I hint that I was concerned for her health. Baba Gale acquitted himself well. The first 2 days she did nothing more than pursue her regular errands. Baba Gale was, rather I should say, is, a man of minimal speech. One of his better qualities is his ability to resist the urge towards embroidery and irrelevant people of his class so often possesses, and which they seem unshakably to believe will be read as empirical evidence of their efforts. Baba Gale knew what was required of him. He watched, he waited, and when he had the information, he delivered it to me plainly. In his own words, she had been to the house where she had once lived with Mr. Julius. Interesting, he knew the detail, because as far as I knew, he had never visited the house before. The dry season was at its height. The view of the hills from the town had virtually disappeared, and the sun looked more like the moon, pale behind the veil of dust. I remember it was January, because that was also the month of the faculty wives' dinner. That year, the one I am talking about, it was cool. It was a cool evening. Gusts of desert wind blew through the gathering. The dean naturally was there, and we spoke for a few minutes until he left us to go and work the room. as was his way. His efforts would pay off when 10 years later he was appointed Vice Chancellor. One thing of note occurred. Safia was unwell later in the evening. She'd been drinking brandy and ginger ale. I put it down to her inexperience with alcohol. This had all been in the days before I noticed Safia leave the house with her orange scarf wrapped around her hair. I wondered why she didn't take her car. Now the decision made some sort of sense. She still drove the Volkswagen variant. It wouldn't do to draw attention to herself on her old street. I considered my alternatives. I decided to pursue my own line of inquiry. One afternoon, I made my way to the Pink House. It had been 2 years since I'd last visited, 3 since Julius had died. Not much had changed. The neighbor, the fish mammy, as I thought of her, was still in residence. At least her chair occupied the same place upon the veranda, and I thought I heard her voice coming from behind the house. The orange tree in the yard was overgrown, the branches bowed. The door of the house was solidly locked. New tenants had arrived after Safia and her aunt left. I suppose they must have moved on, and the landlord had his own plans for the place. The whole place had an air of neglect. What was it that made it so? The darkness at the windows, the absence of tread upon the stone stairs, now covered in dust, or just the inexplicable lack of a life force. The Pink House was utterly still. I walked down the side of the house, where I knew there should be found a small gate. It had been rarely used, except by Safia when she was delivering the potted plants and hanging baskets she sold for weddings and other events. The gate opened easily. Somehow this was exactly as I knew it would be. The garden was ordered and neat. Somebody had been here recently. The thought entered my mind that the landlord had employed a gardener while the house was empty. As I walked on, I knew the idea carried no weight. No doubt at all. This was Safia's doing. I made my way down the path to the end of the garden and back into the past. The place I had stood drunkenly under the tree and stared at the stars on the night of the moon landing, where I had stood with Safia before the Hamilton lilies in the first weeks of our meetings, and again 2 years ago when she had briefly alluded to the possibility of a future, and my heart had crowded with hope. The lilies were splendid, dozens of them, deepest crimson, their great funnel-shaped heads turned towards me. Can a flower adopt an expression? I asked, before I know you will think me fanciful if I say so, or thought so then. Standing there, it was as though I had opened a door upon a room full of silent children, watchful, listening, waiting. I knew I had found what I'd been looking for. I turned to go. The fish mammy was there on her veranda when I left. I felt her eyes upon my back as I walked down the street. For once, she was silent. And in her silence, she was more eloquent than in anything her barbed tongue could produce. In the final weeks of 1972, our daughter was born. I told myself I had given Safia the one thing Julius had not. It made no difference. Safia remained as remote as ever. A stillness came over her. It was as if she had realized her error in marrying me. But now it was too late. So, as many women do, she swallowed the bitterness of her regret and submitted. The stillness was what was left. The aunt came back from the village, and Safia relinquished most of the responsibility of the child to her. In our gratitude, we named the child for the old lady, not the little girl's real name, for that had already been chosen, but her house name, the name we called her by. As for me, I loved the child from the start, and she loved me in return. I have no doubt this is the experience of all men, or at the very least a great many. Perhaps even to talk of an infant's love is a foolishness, for doesn't a child love selfishly, like a puppy, whoever will take care of them? But for once in my life, I never had to ask what somebody saw in me, or question why she might wish to spend her time with me. Wonder at her motives. She was my daughter. I, her father, the first love I had ever been able to take for granted. Even Baba Gale came under the child's spell. She taught him his letters, you know. I would find him sitting among her dolls and teddy bears in front of her toy blackboard. She liked to play teacher. Later, he sat with her while she did her homework. He'd copy out the same psalms and sentences alongside her. In this way, he learned to read, and he reads perfectly well, though he is careful to maintain otherwise. He will take her to the mosque with him on Fridays and show her off, pretend he is his own daughter. Wheezing, a flailing arm, a shaking hand, the old man's body convulses upon the bed. His mouth opens and closes. Adrian jumps up, puts his arms under the old man's armpits, and pulls him up. He runs to the door and calls a nurse. He waits in the corridor while the nurse attends to her patient. All around him is silence, save for the hollow scrapes of a bucket being pushed along the floor of the corridor, the slosh of water, the sound of the hospital gates opening and a vehicle entering. Adrian thinks about the last part of Elias Cole's story. The child, of course, was Mama Kay.